When we speak of cinema, one of the first things that comes to our mind are the large theatre halls where audiences flock to watch several forms of arts. Motion pictures are the current dominant form, but there are a variety of theatrics as well. Some of the oldest forms of cinema, like plays, symphonies and presentations, have their own history and origins, and these are taught exclusively in some of the leading universities and colleges of literature and arts. Back in the days when there were no large screens, audiences used to enjoy actors acting on stages and delivering some of the finest rhetorical performances. Although these might seem out of place in the current timeline, stage performances used to be the mainstream cinematic experience back then. There were absence of cameras and several lighting and special effects that we see today, although stress was put on quality acting. Most schools and colleges still conduct plays and rhetoric, since these play a more important role in sending out vital messages to the community rather than movies and motion pictures. Cinema has also evolved into including animated pictures nowadays, starting from the 1940s, when one of the first animated cartoon pictures were released. Since almost every individual currently alive has been to the theatre, most really do not know about its origins and specifically the difference and at the same time the relation between theatrics and cinema. To understand the role of cinema in our society, its impact and legacy that is permanently felt, it is thus of a vital importance that its history be understood and, surprisingly, how it has remained pretty much the same ever since its origins in the 6th century BC. Thus, in consideration to the importance of the history of cinema, its origins in ancient Greece and thereby its continuance by the Romans is one of the first stepping stones in understanding cinema's past. Ancient era was, however, not just identified by the Greeks and Romans' contribution in theatrical history. Several other forms of theatre that are still observed throughout Asia and Africa have had their own importance, at least in regional terms, and they have contributed their part in theatrics in individual forms and methods. Well-known theatrical forms of Han and Yuan of China, in addition to Sanskrit, Kathakali and various other Indian theatrics, have played a vital role in evolving Asian cinema over the past few millennia. However, the dominant role has always been that of Greek and Roman styles that got evolved into sophisticated theatre arts during Roman era, and then further during Middle Ages when several playwriters and poets started developing theatrics in conjecture with existing literary forms and entities. And thus, there are some of the most commonly known classical plays like Julius Caesar by Shakespeare and several others written by contemporary Spanish dramatists and writers like Calderón de la Barca, Lope de Vega, Juan de la Encina, among many others, that are still played out on international stages to this day and require an in-depth explanation towards their evolution and contribution to our modern cinema. Classical inception. Cinema is perhaps one of the oldest and revered forms of arts. It has survived and accompanied mankind ever since its very first beginnings that are officially attributed to the 6th century BC, when the Greeks were the first people to invent it. Credit being thus given to them, what we see today in our modern-day theatres and cinemas, with all the special effects and eye candy, goes all the way back to ancient Greece in the city of Athens, where the very first actors laid out their theatrical performances at stages and Greek theatres that still stand today on the city's outskirts. Little is actually known about these very first performances. Unlike most theatrics and motion pictures of today that list our credits in the end involving the whole crew, back then, scribes and casual writers used to store the details. Since these were more prone to destruction and mishandling, their whereabouts still remain unknown. It might be of some people's opinion that history has been unfair to those unsung actors and dramatists who invented cinema for the first time, but it is rather not surprising that records that date back to the 5th and 6th century are liable to remain obscure. What is actually known is that certain dramatists like Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides were some of the best and earliest known writers. The nature of theatrics and cinema was somewhat different than our modern-day concept and also less frequent. Most performances and plays related to nature and all its elements, wild animals, so and so forth. Greek theatre was primarily distinguished by three categories, where dramatists agree still exist pretty much the same manner in our modern times. These categories were tragedy, comedy and drama. Three of these genres are some of the most commonly seen and dominant genres even to this day, with drama being one of the highest watched. During the classical period of Greece, when city-states like Athens, Sparta and Thessalonica played the most part in shaping further the Greek civilization, these plays and performances used to be limited only for certain festivals and social gatherings. Athens was never a purely monarchical state, so most functions here were state-sponsored. Greek city-states also had differing cultures and value setups. While Athenians were more of a commercial, trading people with expansionist beliefs, states like Sparta and Thessalonica were more localized and practiced different values than the rest. Sparta, for example, was more of militaristic state, with stress laid on maintaining itself as a state, with the military playing the dominant role. Now, in this classical period, Athens probably shaped Greek culture more than anyone else. Athens was a wealthy and a large city-state and exercised political influence over its contemporaries. At some point of time, Athenians had also dreamt of uniting Greece under the Athenian banner, although they failed in that aspect. Such circumstances had direct cultural implications on Greek society and cinema. Since Athens distinguished itself as the most culturally rich Greek state, several writers and dramatists that we read about mostly belonged to this state. In the history of cinema, Athenians are thus given important credits for inventing cinema and theatrics and also keeping it as an art that would survive for most part of human history. Archaeology has been extensively executed in this aspect, and several plays and scripts of those times have been unearthed. What most people might have imagined as non-existent, there are only 32 of over 1,000 plays that have been kept safe and secure at several museums. The rest have through time been destroyed. The three authors listed above themselves have had an unfortunate telling in that quite an appreciable portion of their contribution has not been able to uncover. One of the primary reasons why cinema thrived in the old days was because of the prestige and importance they carried socially and politically. Most of these performances related to mythology and, as already been described above, nature and its elements. Wars and heroes were another popular topic, as also satire plays and theatrics that could have acted as political propaganda. Whatever might be the motive behind those performances, these were mostly staged during special occasions like festivals and gatherings commissioned by leading individuals and statesmen. Performances were finally executed during festivals. For example, during the Festival of Dionysus, the god of fertility and wine. Special competitions were held in this regard in the city's Dionysia. Dramatists participating in the competition were required to present a tetralogy of plays that included 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play. The Festival of Dionysus was not the only festival of ancient Greece. Like all other contemporary ancient societies, it too followed a widely varying festival culture with importance of each one people's perceptions, values and beliefs. Athens itself was a classical city with a classical culture. Most of the Greek mythology that is taught and is read by millions today is mostly an Athenian contribution. Old Greek theatre was more or less based on these mythologies produced by Athens. The best-known Athenian form of theatre was the tragedy that involved intense performances by several actors on various stories and dramas of that era. Although much of these performances have disappeared, archaeologists still have clues on their contextual aspect, with close to only 30 being survived till now. Perhaps the most famous of these tragic plays is the Persians, a tragedy that involved the reaction of Persians at their defeat at Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. The Persians is also one of the noted exception when it comes to dramatizing tragic events. This play was strictly based on true facts with tragic incidents of the battle that took place just 8 years prior to the performing of this play. Most Athenian performances that related to the tragedy genre were more mythological than real. The Persians was an exception. In 472 BC, the year that Aeschylus won the first prize for his tragic plays, his work was also immortalized. More than a century later, Aristotle appreciated Aeschylus' work and wrote an analysis on it, known as Poetics, written down in 335 BC, around the same time when Macedonians had well established a Hellenist regime in almost all of Middle East, Eastern Central Asia, all the way to the gates of India. His theories on plays and performances, with his usual rhetoric, for which he is considered to be one of its founding fathers, were influential enough to lay down an imprint on Asian theatre as well. During the time when the Greeks were reaching their zenith, the dominant power in the Middle East and Central Asia was held by Persians. Not much is known of Persian theatre, although performances were conducted at the pleasure of the Shah. Asian theatre, however, consisted of a number of other cultures as well. Theatrical performances during Vedic times was quite common in Indian kingdoms, and that is still observed to a considerable extent in Indian rural areas. Schools and local gatherings hold small skits and plays for the children to cherish, with several important events from the Mahabharata, Ramayana and several other ancient Indian texts being one of the most commonly observed themes. For most part, Greek theatre also might have had an influence on Indian performances as well. Since this culture was already prevalent in the subcontinent, the contact with the Greeks and their settlement around Balkh and Kabul regions that were at the time categorized as being composed of Buddhist and Hindu populations molded theatrics just in the same manner as happened with other forms of art. Athenian tragedy would go on to relinquish and enjoy much popularity in the coming decades and centuries to come. As with all other art forms that survive the test of time, Greek theatre would henceforth get adopted by an even greater political power that was rising in the Mediterranean, just after Alexander's death. The Romans were now at the centre of everything, and they would ensure that theatre would permanently become a human art. The Roman Advent. The Roman Empire reached its peak after almost a millennium of its inception. Coming from a small city-state that, legend has it, was primarily founded by Remus and Romulus, the Republic's beginnings were as chaotic and violent as its end. Rome is officially attributed to have founded around 300 BC. Its initial history is like any other civilization before it. The Republic basically started off as a small settlement that would in the coming centuries encompass almost whole of Western and Central Europe. It would also encompass for almost 5 centuries the areas of Anatolia and the adjoining regions of Georgia and Eurasia, northern Africa all the way to Morocco and Iberia. Rome's rule for close to 1,000 years is perhaps the stepping stone of European civilization. If the Greeks occupied the classical pages of mythology, Rome was the founder of actual Europe. Roman laws and governance styles of architecture and arts, and the literary influence, everything is still observed to this day. Latin is the official language of the Bible, and nearly every colonial landmark built to fascinate thousands has Roman-styled architecture. Similar to everything that has Roman influence, theatrics played an important role here too. Greek cinema simply remained limited and confined in spite of its grand performances and its establishment in Greek art as a sure form of entertainment. But the Greeks had their own limitations. Theatrics in their cities remained mostly state-sponsored and were carried out primarily during seasons and festivals. Some exceptions remained if a king or an influential personality would call for a performance. Although this had its own importance, the idea of state-sponsored stage performances got amplified only during Roman rule. If details need be listed out, Rome, in its initial stages, was more of a socialist republic, with the plebs contributing a major part in its development and expansion into the Italian peninsula. During this time, Roman society too was never very class-based, unlike the Greeks, especially Athenians, that were characterized by their elites and middle classes. Roman egalitarianism was probably one of the reasons why it achieved success during its expansionary periods. However, as happens with most old societies, Rome witnessed developments in its class systems as well. Several Roman families had now established themselves as some of the most influential of all. The Julia family, for example, where Julius Caesar belonged, and these would later on become de facto rulers of the Republic. This was also the peak time when Roman theatre would soon spread throughout Europe and give way to medieval cinema. Theatrics in the Italian peninsula had existed well before Rome's rise. Northern Italy was primarily populated by the Etruscans, who might be considered as a cousin culture of Rome. The Etruscans had a more sophisticated culture before Rome's establishment and hence had their own form of theatre. Similar to the Greeks, the Etruscans carried out their own plays and performances that would later on get adopted by the Romans themselves. Although no discrete records exist of Etruscan performances, some landmarks and small theatres have been unearthed in parts of northern Italy. The popularization of theatrics in Roman society is attributed to the era when the Republic was being transformed into an imperial power. By 200 BC, Rome had encompassed almost all of the Mediterranean and it established itself as the major power in the region. Only time remained on the remaining parts of Western Europe, Britannia and Central Europe to get included in the empire. Roman government was initially carried out by senators. The Senate was one of the standing pillars of Roman society. Since theatrics during this time still remained a stately affair, this remained a rare show in most Roman settlements. The spread of early cinema was thus credited to a line of emperors who made it a national policy to encourage Greek forms of arts, literature and of course theatre. By the time Julius Caesar was assassinated, the environment in Rome had already changed. The Republic no longer remained a republic in true sense, and the territories it controlled became humongous. From a socialist setup that included only the Italian peninsula, by 100 BC, Rome was now almost all of Western Mediterranean, France, certain Germanic regions, Northern Africa and Greek territories. Emperors have had personal relationships with theatrics, and their Roman contemporaries did not hesitate to include these into their culture. Nero was especially fond of Greek arts, he himself being an ardent player of the lyre. Setting aside his controversial rule, theatrics and fine arts ironically flourished the most during his time. As the Republic became a full-fledged imperial power, starting from Augustus' reign, emperors started becoming more and more attracted to encouraging theatrical arts and making it a national focus. Nero even commissioned several Roman theatres and auditoriums, some of them still surviving to this day. Hadrian was another advocate of Greek arts and further encouraged these to fit into the Roman environment. Several such notable Roman rulers further encouraged and developed a number of art styles and forms that would go on all the way to the medieval ages. Although the Colosseum of Rome never really hosted performances and staged plays, it acts as a reminder of how arts really evolved during Roman era. Notwithstanding the theatrics of adjoining cultures, Roman cinema made theatrics reach its peak around the middle of 100 to 200 BC, when several Roman writers like Titus Plautus, Publius Terentius Afer, Quintus Ennius, Marcus Pacuvius and Lucius Acus lived. These writers contributed to Roman theatre significantly than any other similar counterpart in their day. When the empire reached its peak, several games, plays, theatrics and many more forms of fine arts flourished. In these later years, since there was not much left on military expansions and public administration, several Roman rulers thus spent their careers in encouraging and developing further forms of arts and literature. Some of these arts are still commonly observed today. One of the most common instruments involving strings has been with mankind since ancient times. Instruments like the lyre and guitar have had a proven Roman legacy. In terms of cinema, forms of symphonies go back as early as their Greek incepts. Perhaps the only thing that survived completely when Roman Empire vanished was its influence on cinema and fine arts. A number of plays and comedies written by some of the best Roman writers got destroyed as the empire declined and a new Rome rose in the east in what is now Istanbul, known before the Turkish conquest as Constantinople or simply Byzantium. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, was predominantly a Christian empire with a Roman foundation. This new power arose some time after Christianity had gained a major foothold over eastern provinces till Jerusalem and beyond. Constantine the Great, one of Byzantine's most influential of rulers, was also one of the first Roman emperors to claim himself a Christian convert. He was baptized soon after being proclaimed the head of the empire, and with it came an altogether new wave of arts in cinema and evolution in theatrics, as the medieval era was now in the horizon. The Middle Ages saw some very talented writers and dramatists take centre stage and developed cinema as a predecessor to our modern counterpart. Cinema thus got a step forward. A step closer. At the dawn of the New Age, Europe was being rapidly Christianized. New kingdoms were started arising with Christian rules, and the erstwhile Byzantium that had for long stood its ground against the test of time was also now slowly crumbling. The gem of the East, as it's seldom called, lost swathes of territory to several political factions and kingdoms that had started to arise as a result of the new religion and a feeling to break free from the old world. In 1200s, Byzantium had lost more than half of its former glory, and it was now facing a major political threat as its eastern borders, with the Muslim Turks advancing further every year and month. The Turks had migrated from Eurasian grasslands and made regions around Anatolia their home. With new people came new techniques for cinema. In this era of constant dynamism, cinema got divided into three stages. Early medieval theatre, starting from the 500s and ending sometime at the start of the new millennium. The late medieval theatre that lasted for further 500 years and ending around the time of the late 1500s, when several of the Christian states banned religious plays and theatres that formed a vast majority in the topics that these showcased. The third stage was the Renaissance stage and came out as a result of the persecution of dramatists and stage players observed among the hands of state heads. This was also the movement that came out in retaliation to the persecutory practices of Christian governments. The Renaissance theatre could well be thought of as the prototype of modern cinema, with plays and performances based more on real-life scenarios and dramas rather than religious ones that were the characteristic of this era. The early medieval theatre was characterized by a vanishing of performances and dramas from the Western Europe front. Up until the 10th century, starting from mid-500s AD, Western Europe was drowned deep inside chaos and political instability, as more and nomadic factions from the East and Northern Europe wreaked havoc on the erstwhile Western Roman Empire. As the former pagan regime declined, the New World took time to fully transform itself. It was not earlier than the 1100s that some of the first performances in Western Europe are observed. Meanwhile, in the East, Byzantium flourished with full strength, but strangely, very few performances are recorded here, primarily because the government did not much encourage them. Local stages and small plays used to get conducted in the usual manner. In the western half of Europe, as Christianity got more and more hold of its lands, new styles of performances started becoming evident. This time, these plays were aimed at religious meetings and events from the Bible that shared the most importance. These dramatizations took place once or twice a year and were performed during important celebrations or during landmark days that had importance relating to the birth of an influential saint or a Christian leader. Some of the theatrics got characterized as purely vocal, There were no set performances, but rather actors who sang songs in a symphony. These performances earned their name as liturgical dramas. One of the most popular and still surviving was the Whom Do You Seek, composed around 925 AD by an unknown dramatist. Later, liturgical plays got some doses of short plays as Regularis Concordia, composed by Ethelwald of Winchester around 965 AD. More important than the early medieval drama was the evolution of theatre during the late medieval age, approximately 1100s to late 1500s. During this time, some of the most notable dramatists and playwrights lived, some of them like Shakespeare and Calderón de la Barca, often equated as a Spanish Shakespeare, among many others. The late medieval theatre was distinguished as having been evolved to a wide variety of genres of the existing ones. As can be remembered, when theatre was first born, there were no more than 3 genres, drama being the most popular. Up until the reign of Henry VIII, a number of theatrical guilds had developed, each one providing its own customized performance. The British Isles had become a popular hub of theatre development, and when added to it the development of medieval-era institutes that focused on literature and fine arts, Oxford for example, a whole new aspect of theatrical development was discovered. The late medieval era was also one of the most important one for a number of socio-political factors. This was the time when the Church reigned at its peak and the Vatican had virtually established itself as the de facto when it came to religious affairs. Europe at this time of history was possibly more religious than it had been ever before. Catholic countries like Spain, Portugal and Tudor England exercised religious affairs with much zeal and energy. This was also the time when the legendary Crusades happened. Another most important factor was the formation of modern-day nations as we see today. Elizabeth had united British Isles to form Great Britain, France was finally united, the Turks had established themselves as the unchallenged power in the East, and Germans had settled down too. Europe for the first time received clearly laid out borders that remain pretty much the same today as they were back then. These developments and circumstances proved to be very fruitful for the people handling theatres. Distinction has to be made between cinema and theatrics, although both are very related terms. Cinema can be thought of as a performance complemented by a number of third-party factors. By the 1400s, theatrical performances remain mostly short and simple. The coming of some influential dramatists changed the way theatres functioned. Heavy focus was laid on how actors performed while increasing their numbers in an average performance, while also making sure there were special effects like minor explosions and artistic canvases that could make plays look and feel more real. Actors, costumes and makeups got their own increment as more, and people flocked town halls and temporary stages. Performances became more focused on a number of new topics ranging from the daily life of everyday people to the role played by the church, so on and so forth. One of the most dominant scenarios of this time were plays based on religious affairs. In 1500s, the Renaissance was gaining momentum, and this gave theatrical guilds a boost to earn more money by providing plays that made fun of the church, and in some extreme instances, even as a protesting stance on the church's discretionary approach towards the common people and its interfering nature in sovereign states. The fervour against the church had gained such momentum that several Catholic nations gave decrees to ban such guilds and, if possible, to declare them as heretical. From 1560s to 1580s, all major powers of Western Europe had officially banned theatres that intended to perform on religious plays. This was a setback for many, but such decrees were very short-lived. Renaissance had skyrocketed and had completely debunked the approach of the Church. As several former Catholic nations started adopting Protestantism, a new breeze of life was breathed by theatres. By 1590s, in addition to the existing ones, a number of new groups had sprouted up. This was also the time when Spain saw its one and the only golden age in theatrical development. Scientific revolution was the next epic phase that would shape cinema in the coming centuries, and this would have a permanent, lasting effect. Performances were now more and more becoming popular and common, unlike the olden times when they were performed only during festivities and important schedules. Now, performances started getting newer tastes of art. Orchestrated symphonies and literary dramas were some genres that are attributed to have originated around this time. And there was no turning back. The New Revolution, 1600s to present. With the advent of a totally new age, abandoning the influence of church, the theatre received a totally new overhaul. The world had suddenly become scientific and rational in its approach towards its thought process, and iconic personalities like Leonardo da Vinci energetically encouraged this revolution, urging people through their scientific theories and theorems to abandon the ways of the church. With several of the Catholic nations now embracing Renaissance as their prima policy, theatres in England started developing with a pace observed never before. Shakespeare's influence was to be felt at every corner where literary art existed, and this needed to be developed further. The age of exploration too had begun, and with it a new zeal of industrial development and economic liberation for every individual. Monarchs, in total contrast to their predecessors, made Renaissance their guiding principle when it came to developing colonies and overseas territories. Renaissance was the key here. With late medieval rulers actively making Renaissance an integrated element for nearly everything, theatres got a new lease of life. As is very evident from the pages of history, several monarchs and aristocratic families of France, Britain, Spain and Italy started developing and encouraging theatrical developments for their own pleasure and enjoyment. Although the plays seen by them remained the same as seen by commoners on a street-side stage, only the environment and aura differed. One of the first large theatres were made during this timeline, most of them being accessed only by the elite and wealthy. For the first time, theatre was now transforming itself into nascent cinema. Performances on religious issues and biblical events had been totally abandoned, and by the 1700s such genres like the melodrama, symbolism, expressionism and especially the Restoration plays became the dominant norm. More and more aristocrats started embracing theatrics as their profession, with individuals like Edward Bulwer-Lytton and Percy Bysshe Shelley being some of the most iconic in neoclassical British theatre. With the new age came new developments as well. This was the time when some of the first professional artists earned their names as one of the first celebrities who would make acting and theatrics their permanent profession. Stages became ever larger and more elaborate. Number of actors averaged around 72 per performance, with heavy stress on makeups and simulating scenarios through moving canvases, lighting and glitters. Performances started becoming longer than usual, some even going for hours, and accompanied by songs and orchestras. This was real cinema seen like never before. Starting from the 1700s, the entry of women into staged performances was another large development. In most of its history, cinema was characterized as being exclusively a male profession, although this changed dramatically during the scientific revolution. Large number of female actors started readying themselves up on the stage, and this also meant a new way of earning large sums of profits by dramatists and playwriters. Since the opposite gender had now entered, women could disguise themselves as male roles, just like men used to disguise themselves for female roles. A big point for comedies, male disguises thus became extremely popular for casual plays with a little bit of fun in them. Female actors also proved fruitful in that they held a possible new form of theatrics that involved only female actors. With the theatre finally becoming a very mature form of art, starting from the 1800s, several new additions were added to it that would transform it into real cinema as we see today. Britain was one of the focal points of theatrical developments in this timeline, with some of the leading individuals like William Jerrold, Edward Fitzpaugh, James Sheridan Knowles, among others that have been listed above as the pioneering agents of theatre development. In fact, cinema was now becoming an increasingly aristocratic hobby, with several grand stages and theatres being built by leading families and individuals. In France, the melodrama had become a new genre that combined comedy with elements of classic drama. Neoclassical theatre had become one of the favourite pastimes for commoners and aristocrats alike, with some of the finest tales totally unrelated to biblical or past events being performed on stage. In the 20th century, the technological advancements made it possible for cinema to become real. The advent of the camera that had been making news as one of the most advanced gadgets ever invented, its further development as evolving from a device used to take single shots to a rotating camera that involved a film for recording a sequence of a shot, simply changed how theatrics was seen and left. With naturalism and realism still the dominant forms of cinema in most of Western theatre, the development of professional sets and environments for the crew to act upon and the birth of professional actors are things that are prevalent today itself. Cinema as we know it, it's still ever evolving as it has been for the last 3 millennia and will continue to leave an impact on mankind in an artistic impression like no other. As cinema develops further to include grander stages and sets, the developments of computer-generated special effects and film editing has made it possible for directors and writers to develop films never ever seen before. With preciseness and finesse, motion pictures that constitute the dominant form of cinematic sequences will continue to amaze the human eye as more and more movies become seemingly more real. The impact of cinema has been equally overwhelming. Since centuries and millennia, dramatists have tried to communicate important morals and messages through stage performances. This has become even more in scale as these endings are complemented by epic-scaled visuals and sequences. Cinema is one of the freest forms of expression and will continue to entertain us for eternity.